Senate 1646 would repeal the prohibition in Minnesota law on planning for implementation of Real ID. Madam President, we are referring to this bill as Bill number 1. It is my goal, and I believe it's shared by quite a few others in this chamber and in the other body, that we prepare and pass Bill number 2, which we would refer to as the implementation bill. We're referring to this as, of course, a planning bill. And we'd like to get to Bill number 2 before this year's legislative adjournment. The information that would be forthcoming as a function of this bill's passage would inform content of Bill number 2. Madam President, Real ID is a federal law that was passed by Congress in 2005 that was in response to the tragic events of 9/11. It establishes security, authentication, and issuance standards for state-issued driver's license and identification cards if those cards are to be used for certain official federal purposes, whether that's entering some federal facilities, military bases, nuclear power plants, and boarding commercial aircraft that are federally regulated. In 2009, the state legislature unanimously, except for one vote in this chamber, passed a law that prohibited compliance. Legislators were concerned about data privacy and security and some of the financial and fiscal implications of that federal law. 27 other states took that same action. Those states' shared goal was to negotiate for changes in several aspects of the law and for resources to offset the costs of its implementation. It's worth noting that the language of that part of Real ID was passed by congressional amendment late at night without any prior consultation with any states in this country. Implementation and enforcement of Real ID was delayed for about a decade because of that objection on the part of the states. However, we are now in the final phase of a four-year implementation plan, a final phase of a four-phase implementation plan. The first three are now in effect, and they provide for requiring individuals with state-issued IDs to be Real ID compliant if they're going to access certain federal facilities, military bases, nuclear power plants, and the like, unless those particular states have received an extension and are waived from that requirement. We are now on the threshold of the fourth and final phase of Real ID implementation, which would require that individuals have a Real ID compliant ID or driver's license if they're going to board commercial aircraft. That, of course, would affect a far larger number of individuals and citizens in our state than are currently affected by the first three phases. I'll just read from the guidance or the writings of the Department of Homeland Security. Passengers with a driver's license issued by a state that is still not compliant with Real ID and has not been granted an extension will need to show an alternative form of acceptable identification for domestic air travel to board their flight. Starting October 1st, 2020, every air traveler will need a Real ID compliant license or another acceptable form of identification for domestic air travel. The first part of that, I should note, would start January 22nd, 2018, and then an extension would be required to extend that out to 2020. As of February of 2016, February of this year, 23 states or territories are compliant, 28 have been granted extensions, and 5 are non-compliant. Minnesota is considered one of those states that is non-compliant. I'll go to the bill, Madam President. Section 1 simply repeals the prohibition on planning for implementation to which the Department of Public Safety is subject. If you take a look, you'll see that the element that bars compliance with implementation remains in law for the time being. Section 2 requires the Department of Public Safety to begin specified research, planning, and communication activities. And we ask that they be ready to start issuing Real ID compliant IDs and driver's licenses by October 1st of this year, so that Minnesotans will be able to renew their licenses or IDs on their regular 4-year renewal cycle. The Commissioner is barred from moving forward on conforming changes to rules until authorized by law. Then the bill goes on to require the Department to undertake the specified research and planning activities, identifying necessary changes in law, rule, etc., determining whether vendor contracts, our technology, their procedures are needing to be changed, embarking and engaging in some communication with the Department of Homeland Security, which they are now prevented from doing, starting to prepare the necessary certifications, preparing the documents that we need to show that we are in compliance. Start to strategize on how we can best provide for the security of sensitive data on Minnesotans. Determine whether or not existing Department of Homeland Security traveler security authentication and issuance programs can be utilized in support of Real ID compliance, such as TSA PreCheck, Global Entry, and the like. Recommending to the legislature any necessary changes that they need to make in the law. And then determining some costs that we need to understand in order to come into compliance. We do know that senior citizens 65 years of age or older can apply for and receive a Minnesota identification card that does not expire. If they would want to use that ID for the purpose of boarding commercial aircraft, they would need an ID that does expire, so we would need to make that change. We need to figure out how much that would cost and who would need to pay. Addressing privacy and data protections, deputy registrars may need to go to some expense to update their technology, their procedures, their security standards and protocols and the like, and we need to figure out how much that's going to cost and who needs to pay. And also, states are allowed to continue issuing driver's license and identification cards that are not compliant with Real ID standards, and so we want to find out the differential in cost in running two programs, a compliant program and a non-compliant program of issuing those cards. Subdivision 2 requires that the Department of Public Safety have this information in hand, report it in writing, as well as come forward and testify in a public hearing setting in front of legislative committees by March 31st. Although there's nothing stopping them from coming forward sooner. The question, of course, begs, doesn't that put us towards the end of this legislative session? The answer is yes. So if, in fact, we're getting the information we need that late in the session, we will, of course, need to see about waiving our deadline requirements so that we can prepare and pass Bill number 2 for implementation. Section 3, the Department of Public Safety is required to seek an extension, as other states have, so our residents can begin accessing federal facilities and nuclear power plants with their existing Minnesota IDs. Section 4, deals with paying for these planning activities and requires the Department of Public Safety to use their existing resources. I'll just note for the record that driver services, vehicle services funds, which are funded by the fees that we pay for titling activity and licensing renewals and that sort of thing, do have quite a few resources, and last year we did appropriate $30 million for use of driver and vehicle services out of those funds for all of their various activities. And then Section 5 is simply the effective date, the day following enactment, should this bill pass. With that, Madam President, I am finished with my presentation and will stand for questions or amendments.
Is there any discussion? Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I'd like to thank Senator Dibble for altering the original bill that he had. Taking a two-step process is vitally important, not only for the Minnesota legislative process, but it's also vitally important for the public to understand what the federal government is demanding through this unfunded mandate that they are imposing on every state in the country. The reason I thank Senator Dibble is that he's using a cautious approach, allowing our state departments and administration to carefully review and study what the federal government wants us to do. And as a result, once they get done with their study at the end of March, just a few weeks from now, we will have a better understanding of how this is going to affect every man, woman, and child in the state of Minnesota. You might recall in 2009, the legislature overwhelmingly voted to prohibit the inclusion of Minnesota in the Real ID program. And it was done for a variety of reasons, but most likely, and what I remember since I was the author of that particular provision, is that we first didn't like the federal government imposing an unfunded mandate. Second, there were serious privacy concerns that still have yet to be addressed by public dialogue. And so, Senator Dibble, I want to thank you for taking a deliberate approach, one that gives the departments an opportunity to weigh in. Some people had a little trouble trying to understand why we put a moratorium on administration getting involved in the research on Real ID. But in 2009, the reason is the legislature at that time wanted to make sure that that accountability of changing the Real ID prohibition rested solely in the hands of the legislature and not to be pushed away or quietly implemented through a rulemaking process. We wanted to assume the rightful authority on the Real ID issue. It was very important for us to hold on to that, and that's what brings us to this point where we lift that moratorium, let the agencies do their thing, and then come back and give us direction and advice for us to review before we decide the next step of whether we should go forward with Real ID. Some people think that the Real ID is a foregone conclusion, and perhaps it might be. But this is a very important issue because it raises a variety of constitutional questions that have yet to be challenged in the courts. The Real ID bill, as Senator Dibble alluded, was passed in the dead of night in Congress in 2005. There was no public discussion. There was no committee scrutiny on it. It was attached to an Afghanistan war appropriation bill that had to pass. We all know about that process, but nevertheless, we haven't had a lot of public disclosure. And when we have had meetings, sometimes behind closed doors in the Minnesota government with Homeland Security, when I've asked them to participate in committee participation, they flatly refuse, and they say that it's not their policy to speak about other governments' decisions in a public setting. It's kind of unfortunate because they're the ones that are mandating it. The other major concern is in the federal law that states that the Homeland Security Director, any time in the future, can expand the function of Real ID whenever that director chooses. Think about that. A political appointee will be making the public policy on every man, woman, and child in this country regarding the use of what many call a national ID card. This information will be shared with other states. Other government bureaucrats will have their hand on it. Keep in mind, Minnesota is a privacy state. We're very proud of that history in recent decades. We have found that the priority is to protect the privacy of our citizens. Not so with other states. Not so with other bureaucrats that will have access to our citizens' records. Will they respect the privacy rights of our legislature as we try to protect our citizens? Well, whether they do or whether they don't, once information goes beyond our borders, we cannot enforce our protections. There are a lot of concerns that in the Real ID proposal from the federal government that needs careful scrutiny. I hope that the department agencies that are going to be doing this are listening to the concerns and the discussion we're having today, that there are constitutional questions there which have yet to be discussed even in our legislature. But we don't have all of the information from agencies, so perhaps they can give us a parameter to discuss this in. We also have the unknown costs. Nationwide, way back in 2005, we were estimating, and federal authorities were estimating, it might cost $11 billion. Certainly those costs probably have gone up just due to inflation. But nevertheless, this will be a cost on our taxpayers. So these factors, whether or not the department reports will cover them, I hope they're listening to this debate because those are the concerns that we should have regarding protecting our citizens in the traditional way that Minnesota has deemed fit. The other concern is that I hope the department rather than just bending a knee to the federal government authority, is that the Real ID driver license is going to provide a chilling combination of personal data access and perhaps endless surveillance opportunities, either for federal government or for corporations. These are vital concerns to the privacy and the protection of civil liberties in our nation. Again, Senator Dibble, because of these concerns, I know you share many of these same concerns I do. I want to thank you for allowing the legislature in the state of Minnesota to pause, do a little more research on this issue before we come to a final conclusion. And that's why I put my name on your bill as a co-author with those limitations. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Would Senator Dibble yield?
Senator Dibble will yield. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Dibble, in finance, we talked about the costs that were not come forward, the fiscal note that didn't show any financial costs to what it was going to be costing not only the state government but the state of Minnesota, its constituents. And I know that we put an amendment on this bill to the planning, which is to be taken care of by public safety within the existing appropriations that they've received for other bills, I'm sure. I'm just wondering if we're talking here, it's the 20th of March, and this has to be back to us, according to this, by the 31st. And I know that we're not supposed to be saying, or they or the Public Safety Committee, or Public Safety Department is not supposed to be doing any planning, but I've got to believe that something has been done, and there's got to be some information that's going to be readily available once this passes to the Department of Public Safety to be able to put this information back to us, to give us some kind of information that we need. Will they come forward at the end of March with some costs and some figures? Since they didn't want to do it in finance, will we get that at the end of March? Senator Dibble.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Anderson, should this bill pass and be signed and pass into law, the answer to your question is yes, they'll be required by law to come forward. And if you will take a look, I'll draw your attention to line 2.21, item 8, and then it has 5 sub-paragraphs below that. Requires the Department of Public Safety to itemize costs involved in planning and implementation of Real ID, including, but not limited to, those 5 elements that I described in the bill presentation. So they'd be required to do so by March 31st. Madam President, I'll also draw your attention, the Chamber's attention, to subdivision 3, summary of planning activities and fiscal impacts, paragraph B. It refers to requiring the Department of Public Safety to comply with Minnesota statute section 3.98, and that's the statute that has to do with fiscal notes and fiscal analysis and the like. So they would be required by law to do what they are now prohibited from doing, which of course raised an interesting discussion in Finance Committee, in which you were a witness to and participated in, the paradox or the catch-22 we were in dealing with a fiscal note that had nothing on it because the department is prohibited from even undertaking the level of analysis that might point to how much it might cost to undertake these planning activities. I think it's a pretty good guess that the planning activities that we're asking them are easily absorbed because they really involve the daily kind of staff work that the Department of Public Safety does every single day. I think it's also safe to guess that there's already a lot of information just simply readily available. Most states in the country, except for 5, have come into compliance or are on their path towards coming into compliance. And so it wouldn't be hard to find out exactly how those states undertook their compliance activities and the like. I'll also say, just forecasting, looking forward to what we might find out as a function of the provisions of Section 8 and compliance with Section 3.98 of statute, that the fact that we have an enhanced ID, an enhanced driver's license already, probably accounts for a lot of the infrastructure, the safe handling, a lot of the elements that might have gone into paying for Real ID if we were just simply starting from scratch, if we were starting from ground zero. But a lot is in place already. So I'm hoping that the expense, the future expense to come into compliance, either expense to individuals or expense to driver and vehicle services funds or the general fund, will be somewhat minimized.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Dibble, for that. Would you yield for another question?
He will yield. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Dibble, in committee we talked about the costs, and you already mentioned the enhanced driver's license that Minnesota has, along with a passport, and those two pieces of material can be easily used to get on an airplane, can be used to enter a military base at this point, because we're in an extension type situation. Do you know, or have you had any information from other states that have complied with Real ID as to what the actual cost of a Real ID card would be for an individual citizen in their state?
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. It's an excellent question, Senator Anderson. And no, I have not. I don't know that information. I haven't asked any other states myself, but no doubt we will know very soon as a function of Department of Public Safety undertaking that research and bringing that information forward to us.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Dibble, yield again.
He will yield. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Dibble, just as a remark, I guess, I see that the cost of an enhanced driver's license here in Minnesota, another $20 on top of what you would pay a passport if you don't have one, $100, maybe more. And I'm concerned about the fact that they won't come forward with the costs. There's no money coming from the federal government. It's almost like the federal government coming down and saying to us, we have to pay for special needs. I have a special needs daughter. The federal government says we as a state have to pay for special needs for our children in our school system, and yet they themselves, and they promised, big promise, to pay up to 40% of the costs of a special needs child. And every time I've been in committee, I hear, well, maybe they're paying 12%, maybe they're paying, and here we have, with this bill here, Real ID, and after, if it gets passed and we accept it, they pay nothing. And it's forcing us, basically it's taking away, I say, our 10th Amendment rights here for the state of Minnesota. And so I'm concerned that we have something in state right now that we can use already, the enhanced ID, that we have the passport opportunity for those who fly, and those who are military have their military driver's license, military ID cards themselves, and they have the information on those cards to get onto a military base along with other materials to do that. So I'm concerned about what we're going in the direction we are, even though it's only for planning purposes, quote, planning purposes. But maybe one question, Senator Dibble. You mentioned in your comments as you introduced the bill that there are, it sounds like, waiting in the wings, a second bill to go forward after this information has been researched by public safety, that there's a second bill that would go forward to take this further. Am I correct in saying that there is a second bill that is in the works, and that as soon as we hear from public safety, it's possible could be going forward with a second bill to implement Real ID here in the state of Minnesota?
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Anderson, I'll answer that question first, but then I wanted to respond to a couple of your earlier points. There is no bill. I'd say to use the expression "waiting in the wings" would imply that there is a bill already written and ready to go, and that's not the case. No, there's no bill that's been written. I've written no language and don't have the information that I would need in order to write a second bill. But as I said clearly from the outset of my presentation, yes, we would need a second bill in order to move forward with full implementation and compliance with the requirements of Real ID. So in that sense, you are correct. But there is no bill, quote, waiting in the wings. We need the information that we would receive from the planning and research activities that would then be communicated to us from the Department of Public Safety. As far as enhanced identification and driver's license from the state of Minnesota, that is an option and/or passport. That is an option for Minnesotans. But as you cited, that does cost additional money, $100 or more for a passport, 15, I think enhanced ID is an additional $15, and they're only accessed in a few places around the state. We could, of course, expand those locations so that deputy registrars could start issuing enhanced ID and driver's license. That would cost them some additional resources, however. We probably need to help them out. And also, members should know that the enhanced ID and driver's license is a higher threshold, a higher standard. You need more documentation and more information than even the Real ID would require. So it would be a significant greater effort on the part of Minnesotans to apply for and receive an enhanced ID or driver's license versus Real ID. I'd also just note for the members that we are asking the Department of Public Safety to examine what it would take to implement a two-tier license program to offer applicants a choice between Real ID compliant licenses and non-compliant license. So folks could get a license much like a license that we get today, except that they couldn't use that license for the purpose of boarding aircraft or other purposes that we typically would use it for today.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Dibble, thank you for that explanation. I've got one more question. Looking at the background information on the Department of Homeland Security, it talks in there in the final rule that they passed, talking about a hub designed for being able to set up in the state of Minnesota, or any state, I believe, for a place whereby this information that's going to be put on our cards, that someone is being asked to do this for us. Do you have any background information on what the Homeland Security is, or have you had any background from other states as to what this hub is all about and who is going to be heading up this hub here in the state should it come to fruition?
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Anderson, no, I don't. I think a number of states, the term hub refers to the ability to access our own citizens' driver's license information on the part of other states and federal authorities. Likewise, our state would be able to access information on other state residents through their driver's license database for the Real ID driver's license data, and the hub would refer to that interactivity or interoperability. And I think some states use a common vendor for that purpose. I'm not sure that all do, but I don't have a lot of specific information.
Madam President.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Dibble, for that. And another thing that's being required by the federal government without no money behind it is some other entity or another group of bureaucrats within a bureaucratic situation to be the go-between between the federal government on the national level and the state government, and they'll have specifically their task and their purposes designed at the time that this is set up. And so it's another cost to the state of Minnesota, to the citizens, for implementing something that is not being, it's being mandated by the federal government, but is not being paid for. And with that, Madam President, I appreciate the opportunity to share my questions with Senator Dibble. Thank you.
Senator Bonoff.
Thank you, Madam President. As I reflect on when we as a body voted, I believe it was unanimously, to put this repeal in place, I am surprised by how our times have changed since that day. I think if we could have had a crystal ball and understood the kind of terroristic threats that we have faced since that time, we might not have voted with such strength against adopting the Real ID. So I am appreciative that Senator Dibble, Senator Limmer, and all those who have worked on this have brought us forward with a bill that we can, with bipartisan cooperation, pass, because I do think it is in the best interests of national security and in the best interests of the people we represent that we comply with Real ID. And I think the concerns around identity are grave, and that this allowing us to move forward with this is important for protecting and keeping our citizens safe. I have gotten a great deal of constituent correspondence on this subject. I want to single out a particular constituent who for, I think, a year and a half has been saying there will come a time when we can't fly. So this constituent, Sherry, I remember she first wrote me, and I sent her communication to Senator Dibble, and he wrote back, "Don't worry, this will be fine." And lo and behold, it was not so fine, and we find ourselves in a situation where we do have to act quickly. The second person who has written me that I wanted to mention is a father of a son who serves in the Navy, and he's about to go visit his son on a military base, and he has learned from other friends that he has that they have had trouble visiting their sons and daughters on military bases due to our lack of compliance with Real ID. So I appreciate the subdivision 3 in this bill that directs the agency to request an extension, in particular for those families and people who want to access our military bases. And so I apologize to my constituents that they are in this situation. I certainly do not think that we ought to put barriers before our citizens who have children who are serving in the military. So I say that in appreciation of those who have come forward and appreciate that subdivision within the confines of this bill.
Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Bonoff, before we get too deep into the discussion, I would just like to perhaps make a disclaimer on some of the words you said. I, for one, am not complying with the concept of Real ID as of this moment. This bill only allows us, from an administrative standpoint, to study Real ID and how it fits into Minnesota's rulemaking and state statute authority. That's one thing I do believe we should do. But complying with Real ID is a little strong for me to allow you to say, at least speaking for me, and I have to make that little bit of a disclaimer. And I think the reason why is that there's plenty of early discussion about it too, when 32 states said no to the federal government back in 2009. And they've been slowly picked off by the federal government's threats and bullying about whether or not our citizens can get on an airplane or not. It's kind of funny how the discussion has changed. In 2005 and in 2009, the discussion was about terrorism until we discovered that cards like this that could be counterfeited. Then the concept of terrorism is not as poignant as what it was then. We've also heard that the country of Syria, with ISIS taking over the printing presses of their passports, are making them so that individuals can travel to Europe or even to the United States with legitimate, legal passports. Sometimes you begin to wonder, no matter what kind of instrument we can print up or invent with high technology, is that little plastic card really going to protect us from terrorism? But the most important thing is now the discussion has changed. Now we don't talk about terrorism as a need, we talk about the ease and efficiency of getting on an airplane. That's the heart of the American public, efficiency, and who wants to stand in another ticket line? Well, I suppose that once everybody has their real ID card, all those lines will come back because everyone will be in the same line all over again. So I don't know if we're really gaining anything, but what we are losing is another page or two of our personal privacy protection and the constitutional right to be anonymous in our society. That's what we're losing, all in the idea of protecting ourselves. I think there's a better way to protect ourselves, and I think if we rely on high technology, I believe that technology will eventually fail.
Senator Kent.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to support this bill as well and to thank Senator Dibble for his leadership in crafting this bill, which I believe does a very effective job in taking a next step and in predicting a pathway that can address a number of the concerns that we keep hearing about. We've discussed a lot of these issues in the Legislative Commission on Data Practices during the interim, and I am pleased to see that that this bill allows responsible planning to take place, but keeps the oversight in the place of in the hands of the legislature where it belongs. Thank you.
Is there any more discussion? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise in support of this bill. This uncertainty regarding Minnesotans' ability to board airplanes with their current licensure and the fact that Minnesota is not compliant nor has an extension has caused great concern in my district. Of course, people who are visiting federally secured buildings or, Madam Chair?
I'm sorry, Senator Nelson.
Madam Chair, I was just having a hard time actually hearing myself speak.
Well,
so I'll be very brief.
Yeah, Susan Kent and I were just discussing that, Senator Kent and I, that with all the little chattering that's going around, the acoustics in here, it's difficult sometimes to hear from different parts of the room. So we're all going to have to be more conscious of that we have, some of us have to speak louder and some of us have to stop speaking. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so it is essential that we actually get this extension because currently Minnesotans, your constituents, are not able to enter federal buildings or nuclear sites with their existing Minnesota license. That means they either need to get a passport or take a passport with them. So this section that after we repeal the ban on planning, it is essential that we request that extension again. And I want to just clarify a couple things, members. I was on the legislative task force for Real ID, and after our first meeting, when it became abundantly clear that the people who could answer the questions did not even appear in the room because they were afraid that they would be breaking the law of not planning for this, I had a conference call with the Department of Homeland Security to try and get some of the answers to the questions that we were not able to get in the task force. And I think it's important for the public to realize that while we have much concern about federal mandates being imposed upon the states, I think it is important for the public to realize that this was a result of the 9/11 report in 2005, and the fact that Minnesotans, that Americans would be safer if we knew that people who were flying on our airlines were who they said they were and lived where they said they lived and are here legally, lawful status. That is important, and it's not just about needing to have a license, it's about really protecting the safety. We did not realize most people don't enter nuclear facilities, they don't enter a number of federal buildings, and so it did not come to affect major portions of our citizenry until the requirement for boarding commercial airlines came forward. So I think it's important to know that we do need to get this bill out. We need to repeal that ban on planning and then ask for that extension so it's no longer an imposition for Minnesotans. And do know that I think there's been discussion that we do have the enhanced driver's license, which is a step above what the Real ID compliant licenses require. We do not in Minnesota currently, because of this ban, our citizens cannot get a Real ID compliant license. They can get the enhanced driver's license, which includes an RFID tag, which some people are concerned about, but our citizens cannot get the simple Real ID compliant license. So I think it's important that we move forward with this. And I do want to call out that there are 3 things that this ID requirement does. Requires proof and verification of identity and lawful status. And I'll point out the second one, that the card design must include anti-counterfeit security measures and features. And then thirdly, of course, safeguards for issuance of production of licenses. So members, I think our citizens are expecting us to move on this, repeal the ban, ask for the extension today. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the Secretary will give Senate File Senate File 1646 its third reading.
Senate File Number 1646, a bill for an act relating to transportation, directing the Commissioner of Public Safety to plan for eventual implementation of Real ID program.
Is there any further discussion? Then the Secretary will take the roll. All members having voted that desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 2 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to.